thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you agreeing to interview.
Yeah, lovely to be here. And thank you for doing this highly entrepreneurial series of videos and introductions.
Yeah, I'm excited for it.
Too.
I'm excited for it. So why don't we get started? I would love to kind of hear from your perspective, the relationship between memetic theory, developed by Rene Girard, and generative anthropology. I think a lot of our viewers might be familiar with memetic theory, but have probably never heard of generative anthropology. So could you talk a little bit about the relation between those two sets of ideas?
Yeah, of course. The relationship is highly specific in the sense that Eric studied under Rene Girard at Johns Hopkins University in the 1960s. So instead of thinking of these ideas as kind of very abstract, I think it's helpful to remember that it grew out of a very, personal, face-to-face kind of relationship. You could say even a teacher-disciple relationship, at least initially. So, I mean, just to give you some biographical facts, Gans graduated with a bachelor's degree in French from Columbia University in 1960, and then went on to do doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins between 1960 and 1966. And he went into the French department, and he very quickly made the acquaintance of Rene Girard, whom he quickly decided he wanted to work with. And so the other thing to remember at this time is that the 1960s were very kind of intellectually exciting moment for Girard specifically, in the sense that he just published, or I think he was about to publish in 1961, his breakthrough book on Memetic Desire, which was Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, translated into English under a somewhat different title, Deceit, Desire, and a Novel. But in this book, Girard basically discovers his theory of memetic desire. So in reading the European novelists that he discusses, Cervantes, Proust, Dostoevsky, he noticed that rather than desire being an internal and individual phenomenon, what these novelists described was really a memetic phenomenon. In other words, that desire is imitated and shared, that it's collective rather than individual, or intersubjective rather than subjective. So that's a little bit of the intellectual context, but I guess even more importantly, perhaps for generative anthropology and for Gans in particular, was that Girard was interested in developing these ideas beyond their purely literary application. So this was a book of literary criticism, Deceit, Desire, and a Novel, but Girard very quickly realized that they had wider application and that he could take it into an anthropological direction. And so I gather that in the 60s, when Gans was studying under Girard, Girard was also reading a lot of ethnography and a lot of anthropology, and that he was becoming increasingly excited because he saw that this idea of memetic desire really had a kind of global or universal application. And here I think it's worth stressing that because desire is imitated, it is also therefore conflictive. And therefore, from the point of view of the social order, if the social order is to survive, it must come up with methods to deal with this conflictive structure. And so Girard developed his whole theory of sacrifice, of the scapegoat mechanism, and all these ideas appeared in his 1972 book, Violence in the Sacred. So to go back to your point about the relationship between GA and memetic theory, it's really quite specific. When Gans was at this formative stage of his career as a graduate student, he was absorbing these ideas that his teacher was studying. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that Gans did not develop his own independent anthropological theory until sometime later, specifically in 1981, when The Origin of Language was published.
Wonderful. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about that book then and the theory that he developed? What is generative anthropology?
Yeah, well, sure. Okay, so there's another ingredient that we have to add before we can, I think, understand what generative anthropology is. And this is the other, let's say, side of the equation of the 1960s intellectual context. So if Girard is the most important influence on Gans, the second most important influence is probably Derrida. And again, here it's worth bearing in mind that, literature departments in the US, and especially French literature departments, were going gaga over the so-called French invasion. So all these newfangled ideas coming from Paris, thanks to Barthes, Foucault, Lacan, and Derrida, were being discussed with great excitement, perhaps not with so much understanding always, but certainly with great excitement. And at elite universities like Johns Hopkins, they were really at the leading edge of this development. And in fact, there's a historical point that I might mention here. In 1966, Johns Hopkins was kind of the gateway to Derrida's entry into North America, because he delivered his famous paper, Structure, Sign, and Play, at a conference organized partly by Girard himself at Hopkins. And I think it was the only time that Jacques Lacan and Derrida had actually been in the same room together. They avoided each other in Paris, but when they came to America, they were shunted together. In any case, the point is really that Gans would have been aware of these developments and reading them. And he was taken by Derrida's idea that the language system is structured not by differences, that's a Saussurean idea, but by deferral. That differentiation and deferral go together. That's really the point of Derrida's neologism, différance, which implies both difference, but also deferral. So, Gans takes this idea of deferral in particular and anthropologizes it. That is, Gans suggests that the deferral that Derrida sees at the heart of the linguistic system can be traced back to a foundational deferral in which a gesture of appropriation is converted into a collective sign of non-appropriation. So I guess simplifying things a bit, you could say that the equation is Girard plus Derrida equals Gans. And incidentally, you can find a very lucid exposition of this synthesis in an article written by Gans in 1981 called Differences, which was published in the journal Modern Language Notes. That article is in fact the first thing I ever read by Gans. And after that, I immediately went and read all his books on generative anthropology.
Amazing. I'll make sure to link that article in the description of this video. I think then for people, there's kind of this idea of how these ideas are all interrelated. I guess pushing in on generative anthropology a little bit, those who are familiar with Girard will understand kind of how powerful his insight about imitation was. And it's something that you kind of look around and you start to see, around you if you sort of take it to heart. What's the kind of radical point that Gans is making? Because I think he does make a point that's maybe even more important or more radical than Gans or than Girard about the origin of language. But could you kind of pull that out a little bit more for the audience?
Well, yeah, for sure. I agree with that that sort of intuition that Girard is almost more readily, intuitively understandable, and that the Gans is somehow more complex, and it's probably partly the Derridean influence that is responsible for that sense that we get. But really, generative anthropology is quite a straightforward theory. I mean, in the word generative is perhaps a little bit misleading. In fact, it's probably useful to know that the word that Gans wanted to use is genetic. He wanted to call it a genetic anthropology, but of course, by genetic, he didn't mean that it was inherited from your genes. Quite the contrary. Gans is not a biological anthropologist. He meant it in the older sense of the term, which means simply relating to origins. So generative anthropology basically means a theory in which the fundamental categories are explained by tracing them back to their origin. So that in itself is a very, I think, simple idea and a very intuitively accessible idea. Another term that Gans likes to use is originary, And, if he perhaps used that earlier, it may have stuck, but he used generative instead. So that's the term we're kind of stuck with. But his third book of generative anthropology was called simply Originary Thinking. And in many ways, perhaps originary is a slightly better term, less confusing than genetic, and perhaps less confusing than generative, because really to think in originary terms means simply to think in terms of the categories that exist at the origin. So that's really the basic sort of idea of generative anthropology. It's an originary theory.
Wonderful.
If you think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when you say categories that exist at the origin, I mean, I'm a little bit familiar with GA, and so, that makes sense to me, but what origin are we talking about here? And what categories are we talking about? I think, yeah.
So these categories are non-empirical categories. That's the whole point of developing the hypothesis. There's no, obviously there are, necessary preconditions, biological ones, in evolution. But the whole point of the theory is to minimize the number of non-empirical categories one introduces into one's explanation. And if you're working in the humanities, I think we can basically take this for granted. So I'm a Shakespearean, I work in a literature department, and, I read a lot of literary criticism, a lot of cultural criticism, and routinely critics introduce into their theories, into their explanation, all kinds of non-empirical categories. Power, for example, the sacred. So where do these come from? Well, GA provides a minimal explanation for their existence, and also a non-biological explanation for their existence.
No, that makes sense. And so I guess why don't we talk a little bit about how exactly it does that? So there's this kind of concept in GA that's quite fundamental, the notion of the originary scene. And I think it's worth, obviously this is, something you have to go and read the origin of language and sort of learn a lot about, but touch a little bit on, what the originary scene is and how that plays into these categories.
Yeah, okay, so originary scene, I mean, there's that term originary, and so that just means it's present at the origin. But let's look at the other term in that phrase, scene. What do we mean by scene? What is a scene? Well, at the most basic level, a scene implies a foreground and a background, or a center and a periphery. Now, of course, perceptually, we create foregrounds and backgrounds all the time. So if I'm looking at one thing, that means I'm backgrounding everything else. If I'm driving, I'm focusing on the road, hopefully, and not on, let's say, the beautiful sunset behind my shoulder. But that's not the sense in which we mean scene in originary scene, because the originary scene is not just a perceptual phenomenon. It's also a representational phenomenon. So originary scene is really a shorthand for originary collective scene of symbolic representation. That's kind of a mouthful, so now we just say originary scene, but it implies all those other goodies. So then the question becomes, okay, so how do you go from perceiving an object to representing it collectively as significant to others? Well, the answer is easy, right? You use a word. You say something like, look at that beautiful sunset, Zach. And Zach will look at it and either agree or disagree. But the trouble is that, you and I, humans in general, can do this alarmingly easily. We just take it for granted. We use language as easy as a duck swims on the water. But, and this is the anthropological point, other species seem to get along just fine without having to do that, right? Even our closest living relative, the chimpanzee, struggles to understand symbolic relationships, as the biological anthropologist Terence Deacon has commented on in great detail in his book, The Symbolic Species. So why is that? Why is it that the other highly intelligent animals don't seem to need to use language, don't seem to need to use any kind of originary scene? Well, the answer must be that they can get along just fine with their perceptual representational mechanisms, which are biologically evolved. Meanwhile, humans, and this is, I guess, the ethical component that we have to introduce into the hypothesis, seem to have had to adapt to a different kind of environment. And so this is where Girard's idea of memetic desire is important. What makes humans different from other animals is their increased memetic capacity. So at a certain point in human evolution, humans began to pose a greater danger to each other because of their increased memetic capacity. And more precisely, the animal pecking order was unable to control the conflict that erupted between individuals. So as a solution to this ethical problem, the originary scene or culture arose. It's the ethical solution to conflict between individuals within the group. So the fundamental institutions of culture, including language, art, ritual, they all partake of the basic structure of the originary scene of symbolic representation. And this scene includes a center, a sacred center, around which the human periphery gathers.
And so then it sounds like, and from what I understand, all of the kind of, latter concepts that one might introduce should be in principle traceable back to that originary scene. So like you mentioned, if a literary criticist or cultural criticist, talks about power or something like that, in theory, we should be able to find that on the originary scene somewhere. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, for a long time, or for a while, the whole discourse of power was extremely fashionable in literary and cultural criticism. In my field of Shakespeare studies, people like Stephen Greenback were intent on reading Shakespeare's plays as manifestations of the power relationship upon which political orders are structured, but never in any of these highly interesting commentaries on Shakespeare's plays would I see any explanation for the origin of power itself. They kind of just take it for granted. And so, the usefulness of GA is precisely in helping us address that question. I mean, GA doesn't simply assume that literature as an institution exists and therefore we must theorize it. It asks, well, where does this institution come from, right? And so, from the point of view of a literary critic like myself, what is useful about the theory is that it includes the aesthetic as one of its categories. And so it explains exactly why the aesthetic is so, compelling as a kind of discovery procedure towards human self-understanding.
That's beautiful. And I think maybe it might be worth kind of looking at a specific example. I mean, you mentioned kind of Shakespeare, and obviously you've even written a book on Shakespeare through the kind of lens of generative anthropology. I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit about that book and maybe even the kind of implications for power and how that's kind of evolved throughout, the history of human culture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, GA has been useful precisely because it offers a way into the plays. And a way into the plays that is enduring. It's not simply faddish. So, for example, it used to be common to assert that Shakespeare's plays are so rich because Shakespeare, understood human nature better than most other writers. The characters are real and they have deep psychological conflicts and they engage in all kinds of, ethical conflicts with the other characters. But nowadays, that kind of claim is, I wouldn't say taboo, but highly unfashionable, at least in academic circles. But in my experience as a teacher at a university, most undergraduates still think that way. They still read Shakespeare, in terms of the interest of the characters themselves and the conflicts that the characters undergo. And I would say, playgoers obviously think that way too. So in other words, thinking in terms of, these, let's say, human constants is still a very common approach to, excuse me, Shakespeare. So if you believe that Shakespeare helps you to understand the human condition, then the next question is, well, why is that important? Why bother to read Shakespeare at all? Why study his plays? And GA provides an answer to that question. there are good ethical reasons to read an author like Shakespeare, because if, as the originary hypothesis maintains, if the aesthetic helps us to come to grips with the problem of resentment, then it follows that there are important truths we can discover about ourselves in reading literature. And I mean this quite, there's nothing fancy about this. If you think of, let's say, autobiographical narrative, or just thinking about yourself, there is this paradox between, yourself as the narrator of the past that you remember, or of the future that you imagine, but this is in itself kind of an aesthetic paradox, right? In thinking about your past actions, you may understand them better, or in thinking about your future actions, you may be able to, adjust them in a more, civil way, whatever, right? So to give you a concrete example from Shakespeare, you could ask yourself, and this is basically the question of my book, why is Shakespeare so interested in exploring the tragic rivalry for the center? Why does the hero, why does Hamlet, why does Othello, why does Brutus, why does Macbeth, why does Lear, why do they kill so many people before they themselves are killed? GA provides an answer to this very basic question. Tragedy tells the story of the usurpation of the center by the big man. Now, in classical tragedy, the hero suffers for his usurpation, which is simply another way of saying that the center that he usurps is off limits to all but the gods. In Shakespearean tragedy, this conflict, this paradoxical relationship between center and periphery is unpacked and reflected upon. So, in other words, Shakespeare's tragic protagonists do not so much offend the gods, they offend their fellow humans, the other characters in the play. Why? Because their worldly desires are in conflict with those of the other characters. So this rivalry for the center is a basic condition of Shakespearean tragedy. And Shakespeare understands that this is the fundamental ethical problem, and his plays really explore this problem. And they also suggest ways that, resentment can be, let's say, managed a little bit better. Not just by the individuals themselves, right? There are moral problems that the individuals encounter, but also by the society as a whole. So there's, political power relationships that are investigated. So critics like Greenblatt aren't wrong to, make these assumptions about power and politics, but it's very hard for any critic to collect these into kind of coherent theory without some kind of originary scene. So in other words, these critics rely on their intuitions rather than on trying to make those intuitions more explicit in a parsimonious hypothesis of origin.
Really well said. And it does seem like that is part of what is so powerful about generative anthropology is its kind of explicitness and kind of unyielding kind of inquiry into the origins of really anything. I mean, you mentioned aesthetics and power, but, again, in principle, sort of any element of human culture, we could sort of trace back the originary scene. I guess it feels like there are sort of certain things in, maybe today's culture that it's kind of hard to think, what would the analogy for this be on the originary scene, right? You mentioned these fundamental categories, and yet obviously culture has this kind of plethora of, incredible, fantastical even, dimensions. So how should we think about that? The sort of simplicity you keep referring to about the originary scene and the kind of, amazing, amount of, categories that we find in culture today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. The most common criticism I get of GA is that it's too simplified. That the scene can't be this minimal. It's never put that way, but that's the implied meaning of the criticism, I think. Because let's face it, it's actually very hard work to come up with a consistent set of categories, a minimal set of categories that actually make sense when they're used to analyze a particular cultural moment. Because, and this is both the lesson, but also the problem of originary thinking, is that we're dealing with huge, realms of history here. Like as I said at the beginning of this interview, these categories are non-empirical, which means that they're communicated or passed down through culture. And so culture is constantly on the move. And so it requires, a sustained effort to be able to think through all these, these categories. It's a historical project. It's a Hegelian project in that sense. And most critics are unprepared to do that. So, for a long time, in recent history and in academic criticism, at least in my field, but I think in other literary fields as well, there was something called New Historicism that Greenblatt was the foremost representative of. And it was very popular. And it was popular, I think, for fairly obvious reasons, because it didn't require you to go beyond the, let's say, synchronic moment of the period in which you were an expert. So if you were a Shakespearean, you would trace the categories of your method of analysis of a particular aesthetic work to other cultural products from that era. So your window of history was very truncated. You would be pushing your luck to talk about Shakespeare and, let's say, classical tragedy in the same breath, let alone the origin of humanity. So when in this kind of an environment, it's very difficult to persuade individuals of the usefulness of generative anthropology. It's immediately dismissed as far too globalizing and far too all-encompassing, and in a way far too ambitious, I suppose. But I think that that's really to misunderstand the originary hypothesis, because the original hypothesis is an opening to dialogue. It's not trying to close things down. If the originary hypothesis is unconvincing to you, then it's up to you to provide one that is more convincing. But that's not easy to do, right? Because it requires you to think in these basic anthropological terms, which unfortunately, it seems like, at least these days, most people in the humanities have kind of, given up on that project.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and maybe one worth kind of thinking a little bit more about, or one I'd like to ask you more about. Why is it that sort of, yeah, the ambitious, or at least perceived ambitious project of GA feels so it feels so kind of in contradistinction to these kind of very particular academic projects of the day, right? Like the kind of wide history and the sort of large reach of this, the scope of the theory. It feels very different from a lot of the kind of papers you might read that are coming out of the academy. So I don't know if there's I guess my question is, at one level, why has GA not become more popular in the academy? But at another level, like, yeah, does it have something to do with this kind of the particular nature of a lot of the interest in the academy and the kind of more general nature of generative anthropology?
Yeah, that's a big question, but I think one reason for this shyness about anthropological theories within the humanities is the rise of science, and if you're going to talk about something in this all-encompassing sense, you must be a scientist. You can't be just a humanist. And I mean, you can see this within anthropology itself. Like, the ones who can talk in these general terms are the scientists, the biological anthropologists, the paleoanthropologists, the psychological anthropologists. Whereas the ones who talk very specifically about particular cultures are the interpreters. And so interpretation is seen with rather a great deal of suspicion. And so, I mean, there's multiple reasons for why that is the case, and we don't really have time to go into all of them. But I think, broadly speaking, there's this conflict between, science on the one hand and let's say an interpretive discursive theory on the other. And as I said, again, the categories of the originary hypothesis are an attempt to make more rigorous the interpretive side of things. So, we agree that these categories are historical and interpretive, but that doesn't mean we can't try and be rigorous about it. We don't need to make this a kind of free association, which is often what seems to happen in literary fields and in humanities fields more generally.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That kind of reminds me of another interesting element of generative anthropology, which is kind of the new light it sheds on kind of the relationship between religion and science, which I think can seem in some ways, especially in our culture today, as these two very opposed kind of concepts, with religion on one hand and science on the other. And yet I think GA offers a much more nuanced and yeah, much more nuanced understanding of the relationship between what we kind of might commonly think about as religion and science. Could you say a little bit about that relation and what GA has to say about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree. Yeah, GA is very respectful of religion and uh, theology in general, because if you think of culture, language as not as not informational, it's not about a correspondence theory of truth where, you know, what determines the truth of a statement is the state of affairs. The sign must match the object in the world. Rather, the overriding function of language, of culture, is the deferral of violence. And that's basically what, you know, ritual hopes to achieve. So already there's this rapprochement, if you will, between GA and religion. So rather than reduce religion to something else, something that it's not, GA respects the let's say the uniqueness of the sacred object. That yes, that the sacred is an imposition, a symbolic imposition upon the world, and it exists only because there are interpreters who see it that way. But that doesn't mean it's useless or kind of, you know, can be reduced to something more fundamental, which would be how the scientists would approach the matter. You know, that, you know, religion helps the society to survive in the same way that, you know, a biologist would explain the origin of the, you know, increased incisors of some kind of animal.
Right. And I think, and maybe I'm misremembering this quote, but I think at some point Gans talks about religion in terms of kind of bad cosmology, but good anthropology. Yeah, maybe you want to kind of like explain a little bit about what he might mean by that.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's another way of sort of rephrasing what I just said, I guess, because as long as you think of religion in cosmological terms, it, you know, it just doesn't make sense as physics or biology. You know, we have theories that explain physics and biology, or the biological world and the physical world, much more consistently, and in other words, that they can actually help you make real predictions. But in terms of anthropology, you know, all bets are off, right? Because the problem, anthropologically speaking, is not about your relationship to the external environment, but your relationship to other human beings, right? The primary problem here is how to manage the conflict, and more specifically, the frustrated desires or resentments that create conflicts. And religion is one answer to that. And there is knowledge in religion, which, you know, one can, and this is the traditional role of the humanities, that one can mine. And the same would apply to literature too.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. There's this kind of predictive, yeah, obviously science kind of has all these issues when it kind of runs up against the humanities. And then it seems like GA offers an interesting, I don't know if I want to use the word solution, but you know, solution, I guess, in some ways to a lot of these questions. So things that come into mind are questions around, you know, free will, you know, human nature, even perennial philosophical problems around, you know, the nature of good and evil. And it seems like GA can kind of shed light on these things in some ways, and I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but in some ways by kind of reinterpreting a lot of philosophy as literature, which I think Gans wants to say that philosophy actually is. So I guess that's another dimension that I'd like to ask you about, which is what can GA do in terms of kind of these perennial philosophical questions? Because it seems like there's a lot GA could say about that.
Yeah, I mean, Gans has this wonderful definition of philosophy, or metaphysics as he sometimes calls it, which is that metaphysics is that approach to the world that assumes that the declarative sentence is the fundamental linguistic form. So if that's the case, then you really become wedded to this idea of truth as correspondence. But if, as GA maintains, there are more fundamental elementary linguistic forms that precede the declarative, then, and there's reason for why they evolved or why they were invented or discovered, then this opens up the terrain to a much wider purview. So again, just putting this into the context of my own field, literature is important because it draws our attention to itself. In other words, its structure shares much more in common with the ostensive originary scene than it does with, the declarative sentence. As Keats famously said, when a poet makes a statement, you don't ask if it's true or not. You ask if it's true or not within the context of the universe the author has created, but you don't then try and empirically verify all the statements that the author makes within the context of the work. And why is that useful? Well, because in abstracting from the ostensive scene in this way, we can, as I said before, we can understand aspects about ourselves, in particular ethical problems that we encounter in our daily lives. So I would say that this, one of the great elements of philosophy is an aesthetic thought experiment. But there's never any, there are some notable exceptions, Derrida, I suppose, being one, but even an analytic philosopher like J.L. Austin, seemed to intuit that the declarative sentence is really a very late development, historically speaking, and that the really interesting thing about language is not so much its what he called constitutive truth function, but its performative aspect. And really, this is, from the point of view of GA, this is a very valuable attempt from within philosophy itself to think about the underpinning of the declarative sentence itself and of the desire for truth claims. So Austin really realized that very little of a language is actually involved in asserting truth claims, and that most of language is all about, the complexity of the ethical scene of human interaction. If you listen to what people say, most people don't seem to care a great deal about the truth of their statements. We're given to all kinds of exaggerations and self-deceptions, but those are interesting things too to study. But it's very hard to study them if you are wedded to this idea of constitutive truth.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I'd love to then maybe ask you, what is it then that underpins the declarative sentence? And maybe this is going to get a little bit technical, but I think, there's obviously these notions of kind of the ostensive and the imperative and how those generate the declarative. Could you talk a little bit about, how that actually works coming out of the originary scene?
Could I summarize the origin of language in 1 or 2 minutes? Well, okay, so the ingredient that Gans provides for talking about the declarative is this category of desire, really. So the declarative evolves as a response to a failed imperative. So an imperative, foregrounds the speaker's desire for an object, and the declarative arises as a predication on that object. And the predication assumes that the object is unavailable. And so in order to interpret the declarative sentence as a satisfying response to a failed imperative, the original speaker of the imperative must be able to accept the declarative sentence as, for the time being, an adequate, description or explanation. But of course, we're still a long way from the idea of this having to be a truth claim. It has meaning within the context of this interactive scene between an imperative speaker, which is itself an extrapolation from the ostensive scene, and an incipiently declarative response. And when you think about childhood development, I have kids and I've seen them grow up and I've watched them acquire language. This is how they acquire language, with ostensives and imperatives. The scene is very concrete. In fact, one theorist who I was quite taken with for a while, when I was in grad school, was this developmental psychologist, Michael Tomasello, who in his research and he does all kinds of fascinating work on pre-linguistic and children and chimpanzees. But his basic idea is that children cannot acquire language until they have acquired what he calls joint attention, which is the capacity to engage with another in sustained attention on a shared object of intention. In other words, there must be shared intentionality in order for that to then be converted into a word which, the meaning of which requires the assumption of that shared intentionality. If I use a word, you understand that I intend something by it and you want to discover what that is. So there's an intersubjectivity there that relies very concretely on these scenes of joint attention. And they have an aesthetic component to them. I mean, this is one of those happy, I think, conjunctions of GA on the one hand, which is a humanistic theory, basically, and a social science on the other.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's really wonderful. I think that this notion of kind of a third order attention, which I believe is Tomasello's language, right? Third order attention.
I think so, yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, but I think there's this important point that this is kind of a uniquely human, ability. And this is another thing that I think GA kind of insists upon, which is this radical break, right, between the kind of biological communication systems of animals and the unique, capacity for language representation that human beings actually have. I guess, could you just say a little bit about that? Because I think it's always a point that's important as people are getting used to the ideas of GA, and often that you get a lot of persistence about, I think, as well. And so maybe that'd be something just to, explain a little bit about.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That is a basic assumption of the originary hypothesis, is that since we can't reduce culture to something non-cultural, the only way we can make our inquiries more systematic is to minimize, the non-biological categories we use in our explanation. Now, oddly enough, I think someone who put this, at least from my point of view, the most clearly was an analytic philosopher, John Searle. He talked about the difference between brute facts and cultural facts, or status functions. And he makes the point that, without language, you can't impose a non-brute fact on an object. So the example he likes to give is money. The money obviously has an empirical reality. It used to be a cellulose product of paper, but now it's more like some kind of carbon fiber or something, polymer. But in any case, you can analyze the physical structure of the thing, but that doesn't help you understand the value of money. Money is something that's imposed. It's a cultural fact, but it's a fact nonetheless. And so he makes the point that you can't get status functions until you've got language. And once you've got language, then you can structure a society, because you can have all these fictional realities that we take as, realities that you better not, offend against, right? You can't just leave monopoly money on the table. You have to leave something that everyone believes is real money, even though it might be counterfeit.
So I guess in closing, my final question might be, why is GA so powerful, and what can one do with it? So if you're coming from a background in, say, sociology or economics, or literary theory as well, why is GA something you should study and learn about? What can be done with GA?
Okay, so I mean, I wouldn't want to be directive about this, because it really depends upon what your field of expertise is, and it best. So I can't offer any, strong advice other than perhaps in my own field of literature. But the point about generative anthropology is, if your field has an anthropological application, then GA will be relevant to you. And it's really up to you to take it in GA, that is, in a direction that helps you understand your field of study. Now, if you are a scientist and you're a physicist or a chemist or a biologist, there's not much the GA can do to help you, unless, of course, you're interested in the social application of science. If you're interested in questions of economics or power. But if you are in some field of human behavior, then GA will be of some relevance to you.